Hey y'all, it's your girl Caitlin, back in full effect, coming to you on Patreon. Anyway, back on my couch, ready to answer some of your questions. I have one day at home in the middle of my book tour, and I am frantically running around. I filmed a video today, done all sorts of chores and laundry, and just went to the gym. First time I've done that in a long time, let me tell you. But I also wanted to answer some of your questions because I thought this would be a nice time to do it, not in the middle of tour from a hotel somewhere. So we're gonna answer some of your questions. I've selected a couple from Patreon. Again, apologies to those of you that I don't answer this time, but you'll have your moment. This is Kelsey. Not long after my close friend took his life, my friend and I would visit his grave and have little picnics in the cemetery in the unoccupied space beside him. We would lay out a blanket, enjoy a nice little brunch, reminisce on memories, and found comfort in updating our lost friends on things happening in our lives. It was comforting for both of us. However, when other visitors would drive by, I couldn't help but think that they think my friend and I were morbid and disrespectful by eating and laughing quietly beside our dead best friend. Was it inappropriate to do this? Nobody in the cemetery office ever came out and told us different, so I assumed it would be okay. I can't help but wonder if it was a bad thing to do. Thoughts? So I actually have really strong feelings on this. I think that cemeteries throughout history were never intended to be dead spaces. They had dead bodies in them, but they're not dead spaces. They're spaces for the living to reflect, to mourn, to engage with their grief and bereavement in whatever way works for them. People forget this all the time. They forget that the American rural cemetery, not the first graveyards around churches, but the big dedicated rural cemeteries that we've come to think of as American cemeteries, started out being places of music and laughter and carriage races and picnics and places of leisure. They're the prototypes for a lot of our, like Central Park, for instance. They're places of leisure and places where even if you weren't mourning, you could come and hang out. And for you, I think that's a lovely idea that you went and you hung out and you ate and you engaged with each other. You see people doing that in the cemetery a lot, not as much as I'd like to see them doing that. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing. Somebody actually, as I was picking which questions to do, a friend of mine in Chicago sent me this public radio station story from Chicago, and it was about bicycles being allowed in Chicago cemeteries. And the argument is that, okay, you allow cars to drive around the cemetery. If you don't have a car, especially in the really big, huge acres and acres sprawling cemeteries, if you don't have a car, you can't get there on foot. Why wouldn't you have a bike in the cemetery? Okay, so most of the cemeteries in Chicago, they found, do allow bikes to go through. But there was 2 or 3 that didn't, and they were, surprise, SCI, Service Corporation International Cemeteries. And there's a quote that I just have to read you. This is from Manny Mendoza, who manages one of the 3 cemeteries that won't allow you to bike through the cemetery. We've had a lot of senior citizens that come here, and we don't want them walking in front of a biker who has headphones on and is screaming along to Pearl Jam. It's a liability, and it interrupts bereavement. First of all, that never happened. It's 2017, and what incident did you have where there was an elderly person plowed down by someone on their bicycle screaming along to Pearl Jam? That didn't happen. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that did not happen. Sorry. So that, that weird article aside, I really think that cemeteries are places of engagement and sometimes laughter, whatever form your mourning takes, as long as you're not coming into some random cemetery and posing in sexy clothes on the headstone on someone's grave you don't know. You know, there are limits, but especially if it's someone you know, or if you're just there to be respectful and engage, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And I'm sorry about your friend. So, next question from Eric. I'm confused about something, as I often am. Oh, Eric. I remember you discussing corpse composting, where the entire body, including the bones, I believe, were broken down into their organic base materials. Why is it the bones don't do this in bodies laying around the woods, instead remaining intact unless carted off by a friendly woodland creature to be discovered by some random errant hiker? So I think the question is, why are the bones reduced to just organic material in composting, but not when the body is laid out above ground? And I didn't know this either, but I think I learned this when I was at the body farm in North Carolina doing the composting experiments, and that is what actually does that to the bones, I believe, is the fact that the inside the compost pile, because there's so much wood chips and a nitrogen source and and it's reacting in the perfect way. It gets so hot inside the compost pile, it gets into the, I think it's like 180 something degrees. If it's doing right, don't quote me on that, but I think it's about that temperature. It gets super, super, super hot in there. So it essentially cooks everything, things go faster, the nitrogen is working, the organisms are working. It's just working in a much more efficient way than it works just laid out on flat soil with just the normal insects and air working on the body. So my understanding of the science is, and obviously if I was doing a regular video, I would like get deep in the weeds to discover the right answer to this, but just the cursory thing, the science is that the reason that compost is a thing that people use all over the world is because it's so effective at doing this like miraculous breakdown of organic material, even bones. That's my answer. Final question. Jamie, hello there, I'm new to your channel. Hello there to you, Jamie. Welcome, you're one of us now. You started watching a lot of YouTube videos about death and dying as a way to cope with my brother's suicide a little over 2 months ago. I'm sorry everybody has all this tragic death, gosh, but I'm not happy anyone's dead, but I'm happy that you're here confronting your fears and working through your grief. I think that's very admirable. Q&A question that's been bugging me. When my brother's body was at the medical examiner's office, I went because I wanted to see him and they wouldn't allow me to. They said I had to wait until we chose a funeral home and we could see him there. I understand they probably wanted me to wait after the funeral home put his mouth and eyes closed, but the way they worded it, it sounded like I wasn't permitted to see him there at the MEs, like it was some kind of rule for the medical examiner. Is it really a rule? Or did they think I wouldn't want to see him on the cold metal table with his mouth and eyes wide open? I don't know where you live, so I couldn't, find out the exact answer for you, but the deal with medical examiners and coroner's offices is that each one is different in their policy for identification. Some of them use in-person identification and will only accept in-person identification in many cases, so someone in your family has to go in and identify. Some of them use photo identification exclusively. Excuse me, ambulance. We're trying to have an educational moment here. Oh, got the horns going too. Anyway. So, some use photos. I'm just gonna talk over it because I can't really edit this, so. Some do photos, some do, this was interesting, I heard about, I think it's the Washington, D.C. medical examiners. They do a camera in the room with the body, and the camera feed goes to another room that the identifier is in. So each medical examiner's office is completely different with how they do identification. So it's quite possible that the one that you were at had its own policy. The difference between a medical examiner's office and a funeral home is that a medical examiner really is this legal medico-legal, as they call it, procedural place that is an arm of the law, basically. If someone's at a medical examiner's office, it's because, you know, your brother died by suicide and they were trying to, it's part of the community health that we know how he died, why he died, etc. And so that's why he was there. And so they're governed by very different rules than a funeral home. A funeral home is supposed to be, I guess, a private business serving at the pleasure of the family and governed by strict rules and laws. But the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office, I think, has a little more leeway to make their own policy. So I think what I'm getting at here is that if a funeral home, as a private business, told you that you weren't allowed to see your brother, I would get so upset. I would get like frantically upset. I would say they do not have the right to do that. It's absolutely illegal for them to refuse you the ability to see him. But with a medical examiner's office, it doesn't surprise me as much because the medical examiner gets to decide what their policy is. It could be that they're very overcrowded and they don't have the resources to have each family member who wants to be able to come in to see the body to do that. Los Angeles, for instance, is wildly overcrowded. I could not show up there and say, oh, show me Aunt Irma. They just wouldn't be able to do it for me. So I think that might be the case that happened with you if it wasn't like a small town medical examiners where there was only 2 bodies there and the nice ME who wanted to help you out. You know, it's really about what they choose to do. So that's kind of a rambling answer, but they were allowed to do that, is my instinct. I hope that you did get to see him at the funeral home and that it was at least somewhat healing for you. What a somber set of questions. But I hope that was helpful and interesting, at least. We'll do this again. Same bat time, same bat channel, right here on the couch. I hope everyone's doing okay.